Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this program series to give us all insights into the situation in Palestine and Israel, with a specific focus on the realities around the Gaza war between Hamas and Israel. My name is Sid Moen. I serve as the coordinator of interreligious relations for Interfaith Action of Southwest Michigan. And my background is with the Christian faith community. We're delighted to be able to sponsor this 6-program series to give us all a greater insights into the realities in Gaza, as well as the realities in Israel and Palestine, and to counter much of the misinformation and polarization that is occurring both in the United States and around the world. I'm delighted to be moderating this series in tandem with 2 colleagues, Naveen Khalil, who is from Egypt, a journalist, and a member of the Muslim faith community. And also with Dr. Larry Feldman. Larry is a psychiatrist, and he is a member of the Jewish faith community. The 3 of us will be alternating our moderation of the 6 programs that are a part of this series. Next week, Thursday evening, 6 p.m., our program will be focused on the media, whether it's biased or balanced, and we will be having Rumana Hussain from the editorial board of the Chicago Sun-Times as our presenter for that evening. I also want to give a special thanks to Naveen Khalil, who really was responsible for the planning and the coordination of all 6 programs in our series. This program will be made available as a podcast and also can be downloaded from Interfaith Action's YouTube channel, so it can be used for small group discussions and congregational educational purposes. As our speaker is making his presentation, feel free to put questions that you have in the chat, or when we move into follow-up discussion, to raise your hand. And I'll ask my colleagues, Naveen and Larry, to help me monitor the chat and the raised hands. You know, I personally follow an annual calendar that has a daily focus on holy men and women. And somewhat coincidentally, on Tuesday, the holy person that was focused was a French priest by the name of Louis Massignon. Massignon is known as the prophet of dialogue. He died in 1962, and his ministry was focused on building bridges between the 3 Abrahamic, Sarah, and Hagar faith traditions, and very particularly in establishing dialogue between Muslim and Christian communities. He followed Gandhian principles of nonviolence, and therefore throughout his entire ministry was focused on peace building within the Middle East and North Africa. So somewhat appropriate that the spirit of Louis Massignon, prophet of dialogue, is perhaps overseeing us as we start this series this evening. Why is Interfaith Action sponsoring this program series? One, all of our faith traditions inspire us to be promoters of peace and to work for the dignity and human rights of all of humanity. Throughout the past couple of weeks, we have seen throughout the world and here in the United States, Muslim rallies advancing peace. We have seen the Jewish organization, Jewish Voices for Peace, shut down Grand Central Station in New York with their calls for peace. And we've heard pronouncements from Christian leaders throughout the United States and from the Vatican advancing peace proposals in Israel and Palestine and Gaza. Second reason that we are sponsoring this series is that Palestine and Israel are holy lands for the three major faith traditions that are a part of interfaith action. Many times I think we misunderstand the conflict in Israel and Palestine as being a Jewish and Muslim conflict. This morning I received a report that kind of underscores the impact also on Christian communities in the region. Saint Porphyrius, which is a Greek Christian church, one of the oldest Christian churches in Gaza. It has been sheltering hundreds of Christian refugees, and it was bombed, and regrettably 19 refugees who were sheltering there died, along with 3 babies. And it has prompted the Christian sheltering in that church to organize a very hasty mass baptism for all the babies who are there sheltering with their refugee parents, with the expectation that they and their babies will die, and they want their babies to be baptized so they can die as Christians. I think a shuddering insight into the impacts of Christian, Muslim, and faith communities in Israel and Palestine. Finally, the conflict has local dimensions here in Michigan and throughout the United States, with expressions of hatred and division and actions of violence, efforts to demonize different faith traditions, calling on us to kind of reinvest and re-energize ourselves to promote interfaith perspectives, interfaith dialogue, and interfaith action. Particularly important here in Michigan. The state of Michigan has the second largest Arab population among the states in the US, second only to California. And the greater Detroit metropolitan area houses the largest population of Arab-speaking residents in the country. So with that in mind, let's jump into welcoming David Dumke, who is our presenter this evening. David has his roots here in Michigan, having served as a legislative advisor and aide to both sides of the aisle, working with elected officials such as David Dingell and Debbie Stabenow, and also with our own longtime local representative, Fred Upton. David has his BA in history, political science, and Russian studies from Indiana University, and he has his master's degree from Georgetown with a focus on Christian and Muslim understanding. So perhaps he channels Luis Massignon to us this evening and in his ongoing work. David is the executive director of the University of Central Florida's Center on Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. He was the founding director of the Prince Mohammad bin Fahd Program on Strategic Research and Studies, as well as the Office of Middle East and South Asia Initiatives. David also is currently the Distinguished Visiting Scholar at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. David, we are delighted to welcome you to this program, and we are eager to learn of your insights into Gaza now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sid, and thanks, Naveen, for asking me. I will say just a couple of disclaimers before I start. First of all, it's about 12:15 in Cairo right now, so if I'm a little off, this is well past my bedtime. So that's the first thing. The other is, you mentioned my background working for Congressman Dingell and Stabenow and Upton, but really for about 30 years it's been working for Democrats. I wouldn't want to present myself as completely bipartisan and neutral on the issue, but we'll start with that and say, as we look at this situation, I'm just going to give an overview of kind of where it is, and I think it's probably best to answer questions you have. A lot of you are following the news, so I don't want to give you information you've already heard, but I'll kind of fill in what I've been hearing from this point of view. And the understanding we have to start with is, first, I'm not here to defend the American policy right now or any party's position as this conflict goes on, but to try to explain it. This is, first of all, a very emotional issue. And it's important to keep in mind, as this is discussed, obviously, between people on the street or in high policy circles, that people are not necessarily reacting to comments, to news, to breaking events with the coolest of heads. This is an emotional reaction to any traumatic event, similar to events the response Americans had after 9/11, although I want to be very careful to not compare any two historic events as together. That is not helpful for conflict resolution, certainly. Narratives are very powerful things when looking at the situation in Gaza and Israel right now. This past summer, I was involved in a project in Belfast working with a faith-based leader, Gary Mason, who originally was a Protestant minister, but who's devoted his life the last 30 years to conflict resolution between the Republican and Loyalist sides there. This year was the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which ended the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And one of the goals of my visit was to hear Palestinians and Israelis listen to the combatants from that era talk about the dividends of peace and how you move forward. It was a very moving and memorable experience for me. But a couple of things that are lasting, that are important to keep in mind as we look at this conflict. One is, you have a situation when you've had a conflict that's been going on since 1948, or even perhaps before, certainly since 1948, we're talking about two sides who both feel very much the victim, regardless of how any one of us puts facts together. This is the narrative that people carry with them. So rather than try to correct them that they're wrong and misperceived, you have to accept this is their reality, because that's how they see the world. This is similar to this Irish experience I was telling you about, because you talk to former UDF fighters who fought for the Loyalist side, or Irish Republican Army combatants, and they'll all talk about the values of peace 25 years on. But if you scratch below the surface, even to this day, the conflict is still there, and they cling to their narratives. So if we think we're going to resolve the differences between how Israelis see the world and Palestinians see the world, we're not. So let's just accept that. Okay, I mentioned 9/11, unfortunately, but we really can't make comparatives. And I think it's been very detrimental to the conversation and the policy process here in the last 3 weeks when you've heard what happened on October 7th was 10 times or 15 times what happened to Americans on 9/11. These are not the same events. Yes, the traumatic experience may be similar, but Israel is not the United States. Israel is a regional power. The United States is a superpower. That distinction dictates very much what the response is and what the expectations of the world are and what the world can accept. We've got to look at what this attack really was about. And first of all, absolutely in no unambiguous terms, we need to condemn terror and the death of civilians. Absolutely, there's no justification for that. But we also must realize there is a historical conflict that is undeniable here. This is a reality. The situation in Gaza had not been dealt with for some time, and it was bound to blow up. You had a government in Israel that was particularly right-wing, who had half the cabinet members who were openly suggesting and supporting the concept of population transfer, which is really a euphemism for cleansing the West Bank of the Palestinian population, which would give more, obviously, land to the settler movement and to Israel. So there was a lot of things lying below the surface here. It also, October 7th came about right as there was intense discussion of a possible Israeli Saudi peace agreement, which from the Palestinian perspectives would have left them further behind with less cards to play for. Again, not justifying what happened, but it's part of the context and that cannot be ignored. So that's the historical context here. When we look at victims, we need to keep in mind, and I know you're going to have an upcoming event talking about media perceptions, but every victim is a precious life. Every life is an individual, not a statistic. From the point of view of the Arab world, there is a feeling that Palestinian victims are treated as statistics and Israeli victims are treated as individual, which makes the story much more powerful to audiences. And it's a reality. You hear about bias in the media. That's what the discussion is about. Another reality that's become evident is in recent years, the Palestinian issue has not been on the headline. The Abraham Accords that were brokered by the Trump agreement completely ignored the Palestinians, brought more Arab camps into the peace camp with Israel, but they ignored the Palestinian problem. I've just mentioned the possibility of this nascent Israeli-Saudi deal. That also would have ignored the Palestinians. But ignoring the Palestinians is not a solution to this conflict. Ignoring the Palestinians does not give Israel security, which is the mission of the United States in being involved in the peace process. Provide Israel security, provide peace with its neighbors, so there can be stability and hope for all parties to have better lives for themselves and their children. I'm kind of going through a list of some of the realities that really need to be faced and kind of are being fought. The other is that international law, even if flawed and not applied evenly in all cases in the world, must be applied. We have to recognize when we look at this conflict, there is a difference between state actions and the actions of terrorists. And I am not, while we are there, much of the program is going towards Israel right now and acting in a way many feel is with impunity towards Palestinian civilians. This is the same experience the United States went through after 9/11, particularly during the invasion of Iraq, when you had some of the same feelings and some of the same criticisms of the United States. A question that needs to be asked is if ensuring Israel's security is an American priority, and this is a reality, it is a priority as defined by the United States. what does it mean to be supportive of Israel? Does it mean unconditional support, even if Israel's taking actions which are not in its own long-term interests or in America's long-term interests? This is a question that is coming up repeatedly. It's a question that's been asked within the Jewish community for the last 2 decades, especially. Is the direction that Benjamin Netanyahu and others further to the right of him in the spectrum is taking Israel the correct path? And should the United States support that path or place conditions on how they support Israel? This is a question that needs to be answered, and the time to answer it is now. An ugly reality that has to be accepted and acknowledged. Sadly, and I say this with regret, the Hamas strategy has been effective and worked. Hamas anticipated and in fact relied upon this type of response from a Netanyahu-led government in Israel. It has succeeded in moving the Palestinian issue to the front burner, and it has succeeded in having Hamas be seen as the main actor of the Palestinians on the political stage, as opposed to the Palestinian Authority, which is recognized by the international community, but has been ignored by Israel. And in saying that, we can also say the Palestinian administration has not delivered peace, which it was created to do, and has been susceptible to corruption, has not held elections since 2005, et cetera, but it's still the recognized, internationally recognized legal voice of the Palestinian people, and it's been ignored in this. Hamas also anticipated that when Israel overreacted, world public opinion would shift from sympathy towards Israeli victims to criticism towards Israeli behavior. This would place Arab frontline peace states like Egypt and Jordan in a bind. It would also put the United States in a position of supporting Israel publicly, as President Biden has, while privately urging restraint. The problem with this policy that the Biden administration has employed so far is that Netanyahu, over the course of his career, has shown a priority in protecting the political interests of Benjamin Netanyahu first. He has not responded to U.S. pressure, except when forced to do so publicly. This was evident since the Y Treaty, since the Bill Clinton administration has gone to the present time. What's the U.S. doing right now? So you got to think before the 10/7 attack, and unfortunate for Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, who wrote a piece on the U.S. diplomatic strategy that was published on the 7th of October, where he said, the Palestinian front has never been quieter. He's since retracted that and amended it. But what he was saying, and what has been talked about for years, is the United States wants to reduce its commitment to the Middle East, which has gotten a disproportionate amount of foreign assistance and diplomatic attention, as opposed to all other areas of the world, but especially Asia, which is China is seen as America's growing rival and biggest potential threat. To a lesser extent, but still a greater extent than the Middle East, Russia is still seen as a menacing force to the United States. So the idea that the Biden administration had, which was good on paper, was to try to strengthen peace, an alliance of peace-minded states, and that included a peace treaty with Israel and Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned. It also included a renegotiating a nuclear deal with Iran to eliminate the nuclear threat. So you're trying to take away the most serious threats to the United States in the region, therefore allowing its commitment levels to fall. That's, again, in an ideal world, hasn't quite worked out that way. Now, what we've done since the 7th of October is we've employed what's been now called the bear hug approach. President Biden pulled Benjamin Netanyahu close to him, gave unconditional support, but privately whispered concerns over a number of things. One, that Israel must provide humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians. This has happened with reluctance and with delay on the Israelis' part. Now, you're not supposed to use food, water, and energy or collectively punish civilian populations. That very much seems to be the case right now. The other concerns the United States have said to Israel is, first of all, our own experience in Iraq fighting urban warfare is much more vicious, causes much more casualties to civilians as well as soldiers. So make sure you have a clear plan before you go in. There's also a question that's been raised of even assuming the Israeli Defense Forces could go in and wipe out Hamas easily, which is certainly not likely. Who would fill the political vacuum? That is a problem right now. Hamas clearly is not going to stand after this conflict is over in any scenario. However, someone has to. Israel, Jordan, and Egypt have negotiated peace treaties with Israel. Part of both of their peace treaties specifically excluded them from speaking on behalf of the Palestinians in these matters. Egypt, in fact, administered Gaza. It was an unhappy administrative period. It was finally renounced as part of the Camp David agreement. Jordan used to have territorial claims over Jerusalem and the West Bank and has renounced those. The Palestinian Authority is the legal entity upon which any deal needs to be negotiated with Gaza, or the West Bank for that matter. Problem is the Palestinian Authority is not popular in Gaza, has not ever had a presence there since they were essentially wiped out in a brief civil war in 2008, I believe. Many of the old Palestinian Authority leadership from the Fatah secular party are actually in Cairo. I've seen a couple of them recently. They're ready to go back, but they have no support and they know it. So one of the questions that's being asked among policy figures is, okay, if Israel does this, who is going to fill that void? One scenario that's been talked about is, and I use quotes around it, the Mandela theory. There is a Palestinian political prisoner who has been in jail for 20 years named Marwan Barghouti, who is popular in both the West Bank and Gaza. And I'm not comparing Marwan Barghouti to Mandela in any way, shape, or form. But the story is, again, someone who's been in jail for an extended period of time, retains popularity, is able to be released, and then lead their people. Some see this Barghouti or a figure like him as a possible solution. The problem is there aren't that many leaders on the horizon. Palestinian Authority is led by an 88-year-old Mahmoud Abbas, who is very unpopular even in the West Bank, the part of Palestinian territory that's controlled by the PA. So that's some of the reasons for the American whispering in Israel's ear. The other is a very real one, which is there is an awareness in Washington, the longer this conflict goes on, the more damage it does to America's prestige. America is seen, whether you're talking to Egypt, Jordan, or frankly, anyone in Europe or anywhere else, America is the only player that has any ability to influence Israel. America's role is traditionally called to be an honest broker in the peace. Well, America hasn't really been an honest broker, and the Arab states know it. The Arab states know that Israel is always going to be enjoy the strongest level of American support, which is fine and accepted so long as the Americans use their best efforts to broker a peace agreement. The problem in this conflict is there hasn't been a viable effort to broker a Palestinian-Israeli peace, which is the core problem in the Arab-Israeli conflicts for 70 years. There's been no serious efforts to undertaking to solve this in some time, at least over 10 years. So that's where we are in terms of some of the problems. Some of the ideas that have been talked about. Israel has floated this idea of Palestinians, the Gazans should go into the Sinai, at least on a temporary basis. Well, let me dispel any one of the notion that that would ever fly for Egypt or anyone in the Arab world. There are Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon that date from the 1948 war that still exist. The right of Palestinians to return, in fact, has been one of the two key issues that have prevented an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement in the past. Essentially, the Israelis do not want Palestinians back in the land that is now under Israel proper, and so there's a precedent of Palestinians leaving, not ever being able to return. Everyone is aware of that in the Arab world. The Egyptians do not want the Palestinians to come and stay permanently. It would then be a problem akin to Lebanon or Jordan or Syria, a permanent one. The other thing is, Egypt does not want to be in a position to once again have to speak for the Palestinians. Palestinians may be Arab, they may be predominantly Muslim and partially Christian, similar to the Egyptian population, but they have a different national tradition. It would be akin to Germans and Swedes, who may both be European but have different national stories. It just does not work. That needs to be kept in mind. It's a non-starter. There are also talks about perhaps if Israel does, when Israel conquers Gaza, if it does, before a ceasefire is imposed, maybe an international force would come and take over, which could include US troops, UK troops, French troops, and Arab troops. Problem with that is that would be a bad situation for any occupying power. It's a recipe for disaster. The US had a similar experience in Lebanon in the 80s, if anyone recalls, resulted in such things as our embassy being blown up and Marine barracks being blown up. It doesn't change the situation on the ground for Gazans. It doesn't chart a clear path for a Palestinian political future, and it's just a different occupier, and it's inevitably going to cause problems. As for Arab involvement in this, no Arab country wants to step up and help Israel administer Gaza or clean up a mess that it doesn't feel it created. They see this as a Palestinian-Israeli conflict that needs to be solved by Israel and Palestine with American guidance. Finally, I think I'll just conclude by saying again, we have a very difficult situation that's been in existence for quite a long time. We also have to consider what is the best way for America to support peace, to support Israel, to support Palestinian people. This isn't a question of supporting Hamas. It isn't a question of supporting sides. It's a question of what are the interests of the United States, first of all. What are the interests of humanity? What are the interests of all the parties? Clearly, any solution is going to require not aspirational hopes for statehood, Palestinian statehood eventually. It has to be clearly defined within a very, very narrow window. It has to be a solution that provides security to Israel, which is what has been needed in all cases. That was critical for clinching the agreement. Camp David, it was critical for the Jordanian-Israeli peace agreement as well. We also need to keep in mind, not all parties are playing on an even field. And if we're going to let Netanyahu dictate what the policy is going to be, it's not going to be a good scenario for the United States. It's not going to be a short war. And it's going to pander to extreme elements that have kept him in power. So it's a very dangerous situation given the Israeli political dynamics as well. Those need to be kept in mind, particularly when you have an political opportunist as the head of government, as Israel does at the current time. I think I could go on, but I think it's much better if this is a conversation. So I'd really welcome questions, Sid, if you have some of those.
Certainly. Let me invite Naveen and Larry if they want to lead off with any questions, and then we'll turn to our larger audience. Naveen?
Oh, Dave, thanks. I know it's past midnight now. So I was, I appreciate the perspective you gave us here. I am curious about what is your reading and understanding of what is actually happening on the ground now for Gazans. I believe the number has reached 9,000 dead in the past 3 weeks, and 1.2 million Palestinians have been forced to go south and attacked while they do that. And no water, no energy, no electricity, no real relief going in. So how is it and why is it that this is allowed to happen, and how much is enough?
Well, I can only tell you what I've heard. I've been briefed on a couple occasions by some of the Egyptian side who are working on the supplies into Gaza. There certainly are plenty of trucks waiting to cross the border. Those are restricted by entry as to terms of what can enter, how much, and volumes. Okay, the biggest holdup is on fuel. But fuel really is important to run generators and things like that provide vital healthcare services. So the situation's grim. Only a trickle's getting in. I think 55 trucks got in today, which is a slight increase, but it's nowhere near the amount that's needed to sustain the population. So it's a crisis by any stretch of the imagination. The Israelis claim that of course, are claiming that Hamas is the one who's holding up and that they're stealing supplies when they come over. And you're also hearing a lot of stories that if you read the media, a lot of stories have been planted saying Hamas itself has plenty of fuel, plenty of water, plenty of food. Whether that's myth or just painting bigger fangs on Hamas, what they've done is already bad enough. But if that paints bigger fangs on, I don't know what the reality is there. I know that the people do not have enough supplies. I also know you're up to about 82 UN workers who've been killed while trying to deliver supplies. So it's a real crisis. You see the Biden administration is understanding that they may not be getting accurate answers from Netanyahu and his cabinet, which is why you saw President Biden yesterday call for a pause to have a time period where you can have massive amounts of aid injected. Problem is that's, again, a temporary step, and it seems inevitable in my mind. Another week of this goes on, of course, there'll be many more deaths, unfortunately. But the pressure is going to grow for a ceasefire, and I think eventually the United States is going to have to do it, even if they have to name it something other than a ceasefire to save their own political face. They voted against UN resolutions calling for a ceasefire. So,
Larry, any questions or comment from you?
Yes, thank you for that presentation. And thank you for talking about some possible resolutions and why none of them would work very well. What would work? What do you think is a possible solution that could work?
well, I think you're going to have to stop fighting at some point. There's a realization. I mean, one thing that's difficult, of course, and again, you do have to look at the experience of fighting entities that are built as terrorist organizations. It's hard to beat an ideology, especially when the collateral damage is so high. So that's got to be reality in this. I think what it's going to take is an agreement to get a ceasefire that has a solution. There are so many plans out there, Larry, that have been developed over the years. Okay. I talked to one of the U.S. architects of the post-Oslo period peace between Israel and Palestine. And he was the one, for example, the U.S. built an airport in Gaza, opened a port there, tried to get the economy running. You have to have jobs for people. One of the biggest problems with Gaza, you had unemployment, depending on how you read it, of up to 75%. That's not a scenario that's going to work. But add to that, there was really no opportunity for a state coming. In fact, less opportunity. So you have to have a plan to create a state, two-state solution, how you're going to get security for Israel. Because really, if you don't solve that problem, you're not going to solve Israel's security problem. It's just not going to happen. So it's going to require international commitments, and it's going to require a ceasefire first step. I don't know if I answered your question. I could elaborate. We're working on white papers on this right now, but there are a lot of other people doing it as well.
Well, thanks for your answer. I don't expect you to solve the problem tonight, but thanks for your ideas.
Right.
Any questions or comments from other participants? While we're waiting, David, I've been impressed, inspired with the number of longstanding and relatively new Jewish human rights and peace activist groups. I mean, just yesterday I was reading a statement by Yesh Din, who, along with B'Tselem, a longstanding Jewish human rights organization, have been focused on settler takeovers of, I think, more than 10 small Palestinian towns in the West Bank. While the focus is on Gaza, feeling that there's an opportunity and there will be a lack of state reaction, so they can just move Palestinians off their land. Can you comment, I guess, a bit about the new threats to the West Bank, as well as perhaps some hope that we find also in Jewish Israeli human rights and peace groups?
Well, yeah, thanks. It's hard to forecast. I mean, you can see a doomsday solution. First of all, when you have times of national crisis, you have people who use the situation to pursue their own political objectives. Okay, this again, Saddam Hussein, no one said he was a good guy, but he was not responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Mm-hmm. Nor did he actually have weapons of mass destruction. But there was a dedicated group who pursued that path after the 9/11 attacks. That was the window. I bring that up again. I don't like comparisons; they're not normal, but that is one that Americans are familiar with. There is a powerful settler movement in Israel, as you know. Two of the most notable members of Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet, responsible for security and for taxation, this is before October 7th, were openly calling for population transfers. They have, there's no reason to believe that they are going to stop doing that after the terrible attacks of 10/7, because now there will be a logical argument made that the only way Israel is safe is if the Palestinian populations are removed altogether. I'm not saying that it's going to happen. I don't think the world population would allow that. I also don't think the population in Israel necessarily would allow that. Certainly there'd be an uproar among the American Jewish community, many of whom have been the most active and outspoken advocates of a two-state solution and peace process over the last 20 to 30 years.
Great, thank you. We're coming to the end of our time. Any final comments or questions for David?
Hi, sorry, I do have a question. Hi, David, how are you?
Good, how are you, May?
Good, thanks. I just want to thank Interfaith Action for putting this panel together. I think it's extremely important to have these discussions. So I thank you for putting it together. My question is, David, you were saying when you were talking earlier that one of the biggest interests for the US is Israel's security. And, I think it must be obvious to Israel as well as the US that what happened on October 7th, the Hamas attack, showed that there is no real security for Israel. Gideon Levy, the Israeli journalist for Haaretz, he had a video saying that he thinks, as far as he's concerned, the two-state solution is dead because of all the settlements. There are 700,000 settlements. And according to him, they won't be able to remove those settlements ever. So his opinion is that there is only one solution, which is a one-state solution moving forward. And I just wanted to get your thoughts, opinion on the possibility of a one-state solution, whether Israel would ever go for a one-state solution, and whether the US would be willing to push for a one-state solution for security, for the full security of Israel moving forward. And and he says, one-state solution with equal rights
Right.
for everyone, Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you.
So, well, thanks for the question. I mean, I think there are some Palestinians who have said similarly, we'll forget about the two-state solution because at this point, we can't have one contiguous state. You're talking about two enclaves where we never have control of security or anything else. We'd rather wait it out. And if Israel is going to be a democracy, eventually there will be more Palestinians in it than there are Israelis, Jewish Israelis. So there are some who say that would be the best path because we'd have more of a say in what the government of Israel does. That said, and I think the Americans, if there was support on the Palestinian and Israeli side, would be fine with that. I don't think Americans are fixed on one solution. They just want the problem to go away, frankly, to be blunt. The problem is, polls have consistently shown that is not a popular idea among Palestinians or Israelis at this point. So unless there was a consensus on both sides that this is the best path forward, it's a non-starter. Even if the populations are so mingled at this point that it's hard to separate. So that's the quick answer. And I know there are those who say, again, if it was a one-state solution, then there'd be some choices about what democracy actually means. But that would then go to the nature of what the Israeli state is. Is it a secular democracy or is it a Jewish state? Can it be both?
David, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your expertise, and for staying up well past midnight to join in this conversation. We also, thank you for your work. Again, as I said earlier, in the spirit of the French priest Louis Massignon, to be a prophet of dialogue and an actor on behalf of peace and dignity and rights. We're grateful for your work in that area. And we pledge that we as an interfaith community here in Southwest Michigan uphold those values and those commitments in our portfolio of action. Again, thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Look forward to seeing you all next Thursday, 6 p.m. For a conversation around the media. Have a good night, everyone. Appreciate your time.